Hi there, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. You'll notice, first of all, that my talk slides have a different title. This time I've actually changed it up to Media, Epistemic Justice and the Limits of Inclusion, the Erasure of First-Person Authority. So I'm from the University of Sydney, from Latin American Studies, and my pronouns are she, her. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. This is not just protocol, it matters deeply to what I'll be saying. Because when we talk about who gets to speak, whose knowledges are amplified, and whose are erased, we're already in a colonial context where Indigenous authority has been denied. So, yes, thank you for inviting me. Thanks in particular to the organizing collective made up of Sarah, Blair, and Ash. This is a unique moment in so many ways, but also a unique context of coming together. I want to start with a paradox. Trans people are everywhere in the media. We're talked about constantly and even debated endlessly. Yet when we do appear, our authority, including those of us who are trans and Indigenous, our ability to speak as knowers, as experts, as critics of institutions is sharply constrained. We're typically invited to narrate life stories, but rarely to offer analysis. Bibia Namaste, in her book Sex Change, Social Change, helps us to diagnose this problem. She has an essay in there called Beyond Image Content, examining transsexuals' access to the media. And she shows in this essay that media access for trans people is highly conditional. When we appear in media, it is almost always under what she calls the autobiographical imperative. We're asked to tell our personal transition stories because they are framed as consumable and familiar. But this imperative forecloses structural critique, talking about our lives. It bars us from speaking about healthcare, policing, employment, underemployment, unemployment, or education. And it privileges respectable subjects, often middle class, white, while erasing poor, racialized, and trans sex working people. Talia Betcher takes another approach. She defends the principle of what she calls first-person authority. Trans people have the ethical authority to define our own identities. She argues that mainstream gender practices treat gender presentation as a code for genitalia. If a trans woman says, I'm a woman, dominant culture reads this as deceit. This denial is not neutral. It's an assault on autonomy and personhood. Betcher's contribution here from 2009 is crucial, but she only partly engages Miranda Fricker's work on epistemic injustice. Betcher focuses on self-knowledge, the right to say who I am. She's an analytic philosopher. She doesn't fully extend this to trans people's knowledge claims beyond self-knowledge. That is, our authority as could be researchers, media, policy critics, experts in our own lives, in navigating the health system, and as community organizers. That's where Fricker helps us to push further, to see the denial of trans knowledge as a form of epistemic injustice. I kind of have to move away, focuses on self-knowledge, but really trans knowledge claims. Now, let me ground this in a case study. My interview last year with SBS Radio en Español. In the full conversation, I spoke about Aboriginal trans women's experiences of police violence, the dismantling of the Safe Schools program, how US anti-trans politics consolidate forms of right-wing and TERF discourses that are anti-trans in Australia. I also took to task the Queensland government's suspension of puberty blockers for under 18s in their particular health program. And I underlined my expertise in public health and social movements, and as someone who is a leading trans scholar. These were not actually asides, they were the analytic heart of my contribution. Yet when the piece went live, almost all of this was gone. What remained was a tidy autobiography. Well, actually, not so tidy. My heritage, being Anglo-Indian Australian, my transition journey with all its ups and downs, a few anecdotes, and a closing note of optimism. So what was retained? As I said, my life story was underlined. Growing up in Perth, coming from an Anglo-Indian family, and also marital links to Mexico. My transition attempts in the 80s and the 90s were foregrounded, and some anecdotes of transphobic violence and also bullying at school. The interview ends with notes of optimism, so little kind of quotes from how I saw the issue of our rights. This is exactly the arc that Namaste predicted. The life story, consumable but stripped of systemic critique. So going further, what was actually critiqued, or what was actually omitted, I should say? It might be a bit hard to see. It's very small print, but on the left you can see some of the elements. What was omitted? Aboriginal trans women's experiences, especially with police violence, the Safe Schools rollback, how US anti-trans discourse is buttressing anti-trans politics in Australia, the Queensland government's decision to halt a program of transition care for nearly 500 young people, my critique of trans justice as requiring more than just recognition, for example, through pronouns, but also redistribution, and my scholarly critique. So let's pause a minute. When I mentioned Aboriginal trans women's experiences of police violence, this was not just about transphobia. It is about the long history of policing Indigenous people on stolen land. The erasure here reproduces not only trans silencing, but colonial silencing and the silencing of racism. Systemic processes. This is both Namaste's foreclosure of structural analysis and also a kind of ethical assault to reprise Becher. My authority is limited to autobiography. And it also points to Fricke's epistemic injustice, denying my credibility as a knower and that of my peers. So it's tempting to say at least SBS isn't Murdoch. But think of this as a continuum. At one end, we have the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, which are Murdoch and Nine outlets, and obviously Sky News, often openly hostile, foregrounding detransitioner testimonies and pushing panic about youth transition care. At the other end of the continuum, we have a source like SBS, with its friendly, multicultural, and diversity inclusion, but only if our voices are curated into the safe bounds, supposedly, of autobiography. But both ends deny genuine authority, one through hostility and weaponization, and the other through a form of containment. So take Queensland's government suspension of blockers. Nearly 500 young people were cut off from care and still are. This was in the interview. It was cut. Meanwhile, the Murdoch press continues with forms of weaponization, such as front page space given to detransitioners who call for a rolling back of all forms of transition care. Evidence-based positive stories of gender-affirming medicine, one must also note, rarely make the print of the mainstream media. The result is an asymmetry. Positive stories of transition are absent, detransitioner narratives are amplified, trans people are depicted as objects of curiosity, compassion, or even debate, but we're not experts or critics. Namaste names this the foreclosure of systemic critique. Betcher shows it is an ethical violation of first-person authority, the right to speak on our own terms. Fricker helps us to see it as epistemic injustice, the denial of our credibility as knowers. So I'd like to end with this question. How do editorial decisions, hostile and progressive alike, determine which trans voices are heard, what they're allowed to say, and how they are framed? Namaste warned us 20 years ago that autobiographical inclusion is not access. Betcher showed us that the denial of avowal, self-avowal, is an ethical injury. Fricker points to epistemic injustice in denying not just self-knowledge, but our knowledge as people who are experts in our own lives and experiences, and those of our peers. My SBS case shows this is not an abstract element. It is how the media still works, including 20 years on from when Namaste first formulated this notion of the autobiographical imperative. Until we're recognized not just as subjects of life stories, but knowers, scholars, policy critics, media analysts, community experts, our media presence will remain curated and incomplete. One other thing to toy with as an idea. What are the alternatives here and how can we resist? Thank you.